Good morning to everyone in the good evening to everyone in the United States, and good morning to everyone in Asia. My name is Craig Allen, and I am the president of the U.S.-China Business Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our book discussion series. We look forward to bringing you timely discussions with authors who are contributing thoughtful analysis, and in this case, very practical guidance to companies that are active in U.S.-China trade and investment. And we are here this evening to discuss an excellent new book, available now electronically and hitting the bookshelves soon, called Selling to China: Stories of Success, Failure, and Constant Change. Selling to China is published by Palgrave Macmillan, and it can be bought on Amazon today, and I understand bulk purchases would be welcome. This book is a compilation of essays on doing business in China. It is edited by Ker Gibbs, formerly the president of the Shanghai AmCham, and it includes 7 insightful and well-written essays by some of the leading foreign business people active in U.S.-China relations. Kerr joins us tonight from Beijing. In addition, tonight, we're lucky to have 2 of the book's contributors. We have Don Williams, a partner at Hogan Lovells law firm. Don wrote the chapter entitled Legal Services: Lessons of a Technology Lawyer in China. Welcome, Don. Also, we have Dan Krasenstein, Global Supply Chain Director for Procon Pacific. And Dan wrote the chapter entitled China-U.S. Supply Chains: Pragmatic Relationships and Laissez-Faire. Welcome, Dan. The order for the evening is that Kerr will kick off the discussion as the editor and a major writer of the book, talking about the origin and the objectives of the book. Then Don will discuss trends in the rapidly evolving technology sector, and Dan will bring us home with a discussion of shifting supply chains, another very interesting and very important subject. So today's discussion is primarily for members and friends of the U.S.-China Business Council, but it will also be broadcast on YouTube. So we welcome your questions and comments over the course of our 3-part discussion. But as this video will be made public, we ask that you put your questions into the Q&A function during the course of the conversation, and I will do my best to bring them up with the authors. I'll raise as many of them as possible. So Kerr, let me ask you to please kick off the discussion. Could you give us an overview of the book? Why did you initiate this project? What was your major objective, and who is your audience?
Sure. Thank you so much, Craig. It's terrific to be with you. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak directly to your members. Craig, we initiated the project about a year ago when I was stepping down from my role at the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, and we wanted to do something helpful to in the context of U.S.-China relations, which we saw, rapidly deteriorating as it has continued to be. And what we saw happening was that the conversation about China had become just so dominated by the issues of national security and the politics between U.S. and China, and we felt that the commercial discussion was almost getting lost within that framework. And so we wanted to kind of raise the profile of that discussion. And I want to be clear here that so the book is really about that. It's really about business operations and commerce in China for large foreign businesses. And I want to be clear here that by not addressing the national security issues and all of the areas of tension, I don't want anyone to get the wrong idea that we don't think that's important, or that those things don't matter. They do. Or that we're not aware of them. If you look at the bios of these authors, we're aware. We're aware of the changes that have happened in China and the issues. This is not a group of people who are naive. We're very well aware of that, but we want to focus more attention on the commerce, and that's really what the book is about. It's about business operations and some of the challenges that we face there. If you like, I'll just hit two of the themes that readers will see through the book, because it is a book of independent chapters that address specific industries. But I asked the authors to address some themes so that readers could sort of see how different people address them. One big and what we're trying to do here is plug some of the gaps in understanding. And so the first theme that readers will see is different authors addressing this question of the relationship between business and local government. And this is really one of the big gaps in understanding of China, just because our political and economic systems are so different. And we feel that this is one of the things that's misunderstood both at the policy level and at the business operations level. In fact, what I've seen from my vantage point as the head of the American Chamber of Commerce there in Shanghai is it's also a big point of failure for China CEOs. In other words, when I see you and I, Craig, we've seen CEOs come and go, and often with alarming rapidity. And in those contexts, almost always, it's been because they didn't understand or didn't appreciate the importance of that part of the role of CEO, is to manage that relationship between their business and local government. And we can talk more about that. But the second major theme in the book is competition between foreign businesses and their local competitors. And again, that conversation, just in forgive me, but in Washington, D.C., where you sit, Craig, that conversation seems to be all about, it's IP theft, it's unlevel playing field, it's market access. And that's true. But it's also true that these the environment has just changed so dramatically. And so our book is addressing that aspect of it and talking about local competition. So you'll see those two themes throughout the book.
Well, that's terrific. Thank you very much. Two really important themes, and probably becoming more important over time. So, Kerr, can I ask, in addition to technology and supply chains covered by Don and Dan respectively, which other authors have contributed to the book, and what subjects do they cover?
Yeah, we addressed, we really wanted diversity both across industries. We have a chapter on automotive, which is so important within China and changing so fast. So automotive, industrial, education, and marketing. So we've got those industries covered. I also want to make a point that within the author group, we also wanted diversity in that group, meaning not just male, female, but China-born and non-China-born. So those two groups do have a different perspective on business operations there. So I felt strongly about including. So we have two authors that are China-born, but they're running foreign companies, and so we've got their perspective. I'll just talk about two of the other authors, or two of the other chapters that I think are included in addition to what we have here today talking, but within marketing. So we've got Bryce Whitwam was the CEO of Wonderman. So he talks about what's going on in digital marketing, and that's particularly interesting because of all the changes that have happened within China. So it has digitized so rapidly and so completely. And so Bryce Whitwam addresses some of those issues within his chapter. And then lastly, Mark Fisher was the initial managing director of the NBA in China. So I think everybody's going to be looking for his analysis of the Daryl Morey tweet and rehash that, and readers won't be disappointed. He does address that, but I think one of the other really interesting things that he brings up, and I'm not going to give a spoiler alert here, but he talks about sports. He's an athlete himself, was a semi-professional athlete. And he points out something very interesting, and that is within the Olympics, China obviously does very well, huge country. Obviously, they get their fair share of gold medals. He points out that there's a real imbalance in their medal count, that they generally do much, much better in individual sports rather than team sports. And and he addresses that from a businessman's perspective and offers up some possible explanations for why that is. And so I think HR directors will be in particular interested in that chapter, because it has implications for how teams in China should be managed and incentivized. So those are several of the other topics that are covered in the book.
Oh, that is super. And I would really emphasize that the book is very timely. This is doing business in China today, and particularly for those foreign business people in the US who have not been to China since COVID, or don't feel that they're in touch with the business community in China. The book is really very, very useful. So thank you, Kerr. Before I turn to Don, let me remind our listeners that you're most welcome to put questions in the Q&A. We welcome that, and I will bring them up. So Don, let's talk about technology. Don comes to us from Hogan Lovells, a practitioner, a legal practitioner in Shanghai of some 20 years, and has been working on the ground with American companies, European, Chinese companies on the technology trade. So Don, thanks for writing Lessons of a Technology Lawyer in China. I would note that you wrote this with your daughter, Marie Williams, which I must say is super cool. Congratulations to both of you on that. So I wonder if you could give us a summary of your chapter, Don.
Absolutely. Thank you, Craig. And yeah, I very much enjoyed working with my co-author. It was great. It was I think I was lucky because she had a relatively free summer last summer, so I don't think I could catch her again. But it was nice while it lasted. So the 20 years of experience that you referred to, Craig, yeah, is in the trenches doing tech deals in China, and I think that offers me a pretty unique perspective, really a catbird seat, I like to say, to have observed the trends, really the remarkable changes in both the legal services sector and the technology sector, since I really was part of both over that period. So the legal industry, which barely existed as such when I graduated from college, is now the world's third largest. The Chinese firms have benefited the most from that remarkable growth, but a number of foreign firms have also done quite well. And certainly not all, and some have even exited the market recently, as has been in the news. But despite the restrictions, foreign firms continue to have opportunities with greater flexibility to operate without restriction in places like the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, which we hope is a pilot for things to come in the rest of China. You have the freedom there to have joint ventures, where you can actually have majority interest, that can practice Chinese law and so forth. But with respect to the technology sector, which is really what most of the chapter is about, the technology sector is, as I think is pretty well known, has grown from a low value add copycat kind of thing with a few bright spots of innovation 20 years ago one of the world's most innovative technology industries. It's quite remarkable how that's changed in the last 20 years. The Chinese companies like ByteDance, Alibaba, Baidu, Jingdong, and others are technology heavyweights. And China's a world leader in technologies such as 5G, e-commerce, drones, mobile payments, facial recognition, AI, and the Internet of Things. So China's recipe for success includes top-down government involvement, such as directives like Made in China 2025, which when it was promulgated a number of years ago and basically called for China to have a leading role in what the government identified to be key technology sectors. Generous industrial subsidies, which of course tend to annoy trading partners, but have been successful in many ways, and protectionism, as well as venture capital funds, many of those from Silicon Valley, especially in the early days, and highly entrepreneurial companies moving extremely fast in an intense cauldron of competition, which has been called a breeding ground for companies of superb capabilities. So that's sort of the setting the stage for the remarkable development. One thing we emphasize in the chapter is investment is a two-way street. When my China deals in the early years, when I first came to China in the early 2000s, were mostly inbound investments from China into China from Silicon Valley, both venture capitalists and M&A involving Silicon Valley tech companies. It's hard to overstate, in my view, the importance of these deals to teaching China how to do tech, as they say. Silicon Valley VCs provided not only capital, but know-how, as top VCs from the likes of Sequoia Capital, Granite Global Ventures, Dole Capital joined the board of directors of Chinese startups and helped their portfolio companies grow, develop, and succeed. These VC investors wanted their companies to be successful. It's almost a truism, of course, but when an investor wants its investment to be successful. And not only did they transfer knowledge and best practices, but they also trained local talent here on how to develop a VC industry. This is self-industry behavior. You do this because you want your own portfolio companies to succeed. So if we fast forward 20 years to today, it's whether it's access to capital, the Chinese market, customers, or advanced IP, sophisticated Chinese technology investors can bring quite a lot to the table for potential U.S. technology investments. The issue, though, is with the extensive CFIUS rule changes that began in 2018 and other more recent developments, these sophisticated Chinese tech investors are mostly staying away from key portions of the US technology industry, depriving the sector of the benefits that I described. We also talk about the IP environment in China, which of course, as Kerr alluded to, is by reputation in the West is a place mostly about IP theft. And I'm not going to deny that IP theft does take place, but I think the real story on the IP environment in China is that the laws, the enforcement, and the dispute resolution has improved substantially as China has become an innovation powerhouse. In this regard, China is following the trajectory or following in the footsteps of a number of other countries that were previously known as IP thieves, including Japan, which, if people remember back to the 60s and the 70s, was a noted IP thief, South Korea, and if you go back long enough, the U.S. itself. Alexander Hamilton advised U.S. companies to steal British IP a couple hundred years ago. So this was, this is following in well-trod footsteps. China's trajectory is the same. As China has now developed its own IP, it wants to protect it. It's very simple logic. So now it puts in place the measures to protect intellectual property, and that's why in many respects, that's why the environment has improved so much. We also talk a bit about national security and interdependence, not sort of the broad brush policy issues, but we do observe from a focus on from a technology perspective, that both the US and China appear to want unquestioned technology leadership and independence. and in many respects view both of those goals as essential to their national security. But realistically, despite both countries' considerable strengths, neither one is going to be able to achieve that goal. And moreover, aggressive steps that each one might take to achieve that goal or to deny it to the other country risk conflict. This sort of risk of conflict is exacerbated by a mismatch of economic systems. The two countries simply don't play by the same rules. Of course, the U.S. has long pressured China to try to change its system to mirror that of the U.S. But China has more and more aggressively pushed back on this. Meanwhile, China, for its part, has long studied the U.S. rather carefully and taken aspects of the U.S. system that it thinks it can use to its benefit, adapting those things with Chinese characteristics. Since really our view is neither country can really force the other to play by its rules. Our suggestion is for the U.S. to study how China has succeeded in the technology sector and see whether it can adopt any of those methods, those policies for its own purposes, of course, adopted with US characteristics. For example, China has created successful industries that did not exist in China before from whole cloth. So how did they do this? Well, in part it was through government directives, industrial subsidies, but in part it was through private sector dynamism. So can the U.S., for example, benefit from industrial subsidies? I think the Chips and Science Act is a good example of the U.S. sort of exploring this question. And I'm glad to see that because I think this is in many ways, in my view, the U.S. looking at a Chinese practice and saying, can we work with this? Can we adapt it for our purposes? We talk a bit, we have a bit of a prescription. Again, it's not a policy piece, but to avoid a technology war and there is a technology war, but to avoid that and our other conflicting interests spiraling out of control between the two countries, we suggest a sort of code of conduct, which is mutual acceptance of competition, interdependence, and different systems, defining national security narrowly and reacting only when strictly necessary to defend it, engaging in regular dialogue on areas of shared interests, and renouncing conflict and actions likely to induce it absent exceptional circumstances. We close talking about whether in the we close talking about shared values. We conclude that the two countries share numerous values, including the people of the two countries share, they value the importance of hard work, education, family, and success. And in our view, these shared values just underscore there's a lot of similarities, despite their differences between the US and China. And whether in the technology sector or elsewhere, we think it'd be far better for the two countries to engage in cordial competition rather than hostile conflict.
So, Don, terrific. Thank you for that overview. I wonder if you could, from the point of view of a practitioner working daily on the ground, doing deals, could you comment on deal flow? My understanding is that venture capital flow from the US to China is down about 70%. And that Chinese investment in the US is down a similar percentage. Do you see that on the ground? And if so, why?
Absolutely, Craig. I mean, 10 years ago, if you looked at my practice, I was mostly doing deals between the US and China, whether representing US companies investing in China's tech sector, which I've done from the early days, as I mentioned, from 20 years ago when I first came over, but increasingly in the 10 years ago, you also increasingly saw outbound deals from China into the Silicon Valley tech sector in particular. Those deals are mostly gone, and that's a function of the CFIUS rule changes and other things that I alluded to. So today, if you look at my practice as a lawyer in the trenches, the deals I do involving Chinese tech companies are mostly involve Southeast Asia, Saudi Arabia, or Europe. There's almost and Europe is becoming less friendly to Chinese tech investment. So even those deals are decreasing. But there's almost nothing now between the U.S. and China. I think in the U.S. the potential for legislation that would preclude the export control limitations, as well as potential for limitations on the ability to invest in China's tech sector directly, has really put a damper on U.S. funds and companies' interest in China tech. And of course, I already alluded to the China tech companies just basically, if they assume almost any deal they want to do would be reviewed by CFIUS, and they assume that if they're reviewed by CFIUS, they won't get a fair hearing, that it will be politicized, and it'll ultimately be rejected, and they don't want to go through that hassle. So I'm not going to say that view is necessarily accurate, but that is their view, and so that's why these deals just aren't happening.
So the change in deal flow is as a result of government policy in both China and the U.S. Would that be your perception, or would it be something more fundamental, sort of a secular trend within technology?
I think the government. I think in the case of tech, it's primarily government driven, because both the U.S. and China are very attractive as tech markets to the other country. It's really what the governments are saying you can't do. It's not. This is not like Dan may talk about some things going on in supply chain later. There is some low-end manufacturing that's moving out of China, or was already moving out for cost-related reasons. So that's a trend driven by economics. I don't see that happening in tech. I think if the U.S. and the China tech sectors could engage fully with each other, without the interference of policymakers, I think you'd see a tremendous amount of deal flow, as much or more as you did 5, 10 years ago.
Yeah, from the point of view of Washington, I think we've seen the changing of an era here. One of the key questions, Don, that you would have a very good feel for is whether or not China will become self-sufficient in technology. It is one of Xi Jinping's key objectives, and we've seen the development of many global tech leaders in China. Do you think that their policies are sufficient to make them technology independent or self-reliant, autarkic, if you will? Is that going to work?
Craig, I don't think so. I mean, I think you can go some of that way, and those measures will probably get them part of the way there. But as I mentioned, for both the U.S. and China, despite their incredible pool of talent, each of them has a remarkable pool of talent, capital, sophistication. But despite that, I don't think either country can truly achieve tech self-sufficiency. There's too much existing interconnection, and other places have too much talent, too much capability. So something good is undoubtedly going to be developed somewhere else. If you say, I want to be self-sufficient, that means you can't rely on that thing. You can't get access to that thing, or you have to have something better than whatever is developed abroad. No country is going to be able to always have that. The U.S. for decades has more or less had that, but the world is more complicated now. And I don't see either the U.S. or China, despite China's best efforts, to be able to achieve true self-sufficiency, in the sense of I have leadership across all technology sectors, because if in order to have true self-sufficiency, you're going to want to have the best. You're not going to want to have second best, third best of class. You're going to want the best product, and no country is going to have the best product in every part of the technology sector.
Yeah, nonetheless, let me follow up and ask, you had apprised the Made in China 2025 or the industrial subsidies programs quite effective. And do you think that that'll be true in the future? And then let me follow up with just one more question on supply chain before we ask Stan for his views.
Yeah, I think it's something U.S. policymakers should really study carefully, in my view. I do think China has had considerable success with these top-down government directives. I don't think it's gotten them all the way there, but I think that Made in China 2025 has really galvanized the tech sector in key areas, and capital tends to flow where the government wants it to flow, even if it's not directly from the government. And there are certainly plenty of government funds doing just that, but there are private funds that tend to take inspiration from the government. I'm not saying it always works, but I am saying overall, if I look at the role of government in the development of China's tech sector, I think it's been a success. And U.S. policymakers historically have not liked to admit to government could have such a successful impact. And I think it's something the U.S. should study.
Well, let me ask one final question, if you will, before turning it over to Dan. And that would be that it appears that the technology trade in goods, with the exception of perhaps advanced semiconductors and semiconductor manufacturing equipment, has really maintained itself quite well. There do not seem to be that many supply chain disruptions in the tech sector, and rather the established players have been able to continue their business reasonably well. Would that be your assessment, or is that overly optimistic?
I think that's a fair assessment so far. What I worry about is that each country is policymakers are looking at more and more potential interventions, and I'm not sure that I agree with your assessment of where we are today. I'm not sure that's going to continue tomorrow. I hope so. I hope the governments don't intervene too dramatically. But if you look at what China's starting to do in minerals, and what the U.S. might do in retaliation, and if the U.S. does indeed clamp down on directly, as opposed to export control restrictions on investment in China's tech sector, I think China may react to that, and you could have a downward spiral where there's more and more intervention, and the relative success that's continued to this day could end.
Yeah, I think words of caution there from your lips to God's ears. We are hopeful that this trade, which has benefited so many around the world and in both countries, is able to continue, and that government role in supply chain remains modest. Let companies do what companies do as much as possible. Thanks very, very much, Don. Dan, thank you for your excellent chapter on supply chain. This is a subject I think that is on virtually everyone's mind now, and at the C-suite level, but throughout the corporate hierarchies. So could you please give us an overview of your chapter?
Sure. Thanks for having me, Craig. First off, it's nice to see supply chain get its due respect at the C-suite, finally. Like Don, I've spent most of the last 20, 30 years in the trenches. In my case, at factories in Jiangsu, Shandong, and Chongqing, and Henan, traveling throughout China and dealing with factories head on, dealing with the ports, dealing with trucks, dealing with warehouses. So my vantage point is somewhat unique, that I'm able to play the role of the person on the ground, the boots on the ground, if you were, and then also answering to headquarters and stakeholders, and trying to balance the two. If you'd like, I'll just jump into a quick chapter summary. Craig, is that what you're seeking next? Good, got it. So I have 10 key points that I'll go over rather quickly. The first one is fundamental. What is the objective of a supply chain practitioner? And our objective is to mitigate risk, reduce variance, and balance cost, time, and quality. And that's it. So every day when I wake up and I see my 600 emails and all the other messages I have on WhatsApp, WeChat, and text message, everybody crying fire, my objective is to balance cost, time, and quality. So when you get down to this buzzword you're hearing today, and that is shifting, why is production really shifting out of China? Is it going back to the US? Is it going elsewhere? Where is it going? These sort of questions Again, it comes down to those three issues of cost, time, and quality. In this case, primarily cost. So the first items, commodities or products, which were made in China, which are no longer viable to make in China, were due to cost. These are labor-intensive items where the material cost represent less than 50% of the value, and labor costs represent more than 50% of the value. Some obvious examples would be tennis shoes, footwear, or shirts, apparel. In my case, I'm in the industrial textile business where a heavy-duty sewing machine and laborers cutting the material and auditing and cleaning the material plays a huge factor. So cost plays a key role. So as labor costs went up from roughly $150 a month to, in some industries, well over $1,000 over the last 15 years in China, China essentially labor-wise costed itself out of many industries. So it's happened before. This is an old book. Go back into the 70s when Japan was the manufacturer to the world. In the early 80s, the four tigers of Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, and Singapore stepped up to the plate and took a lot of the labor-intensive production away from Japan. Then in the early 90s, the same story happened over again, where those four countries had great success in manufacturing, but with success comes money. And the white-collar workforce grows up, and they don't want their children to have the same blue-collar experience that they did. They want a better life for the next generation. China stepped up to the plate with its no-cost to low-cost type of scaling of production. And what's interesting about China is it's held on to its throne as the global manufacturer longer than anybody. It's 20 plus years now. And I argue that China is going to maintain that role in certain industry segments and for certain export market and domestic market segments. So China's still there. It's not going anywhere, but it's going to play less of a role in the labor-intensive manufacturing for US and Europe and Canadian markets. So that's really the first point in summary of the chapter. Second point, getting back to that balance of cost, time, and quality that every supply chain practitioner will preach to you, is that government interference is artificial and it causes inefficiencies. It causes over and under stocks, and it causes ultimately inflation. So that's a concern, that if you have understock, not enough merchandise, and everybody wants that same product, the cost per unit is going to go up. Third point I want to make, it's China in a relationship with American supply chain practitioners, let's say in procurement, it's a value proposition. What is each party bringing to the table? And that could be true, somebody in Cleveland buying something from Indianapolis. It could be true for somebody in LA buying something from Beijing. The point being is, at the end of the day, in private sector purchasing, I'm not driven by anything other than, is it the best product at the right time at the right price? And can you do it consistently? So that's, and basically my point is, and that's the overriding theme of the chapter, it's a value proposition. What are you bringing to the table? Why should I buy from you instead of the next person? Now, as Kerr commented on earlier, I do want to point out that in my chapter, I'm ignoring military dual use items, IP infraction, fraud, strategic resources. I'm not talking about those four important issues. I'm ignoring those. I'm talking about commercial sector items like polypropylene bulk bags that I'm involved in. Those do not have a secondary use. Fraud does not exist. There is no IP infraction. And polypropylene, which is oil derivative, is not a strategic resource. It is, but neither country's playing that card right now. The fourth point I want to make is the role of COVID-19. And essentially what happened was, with mostly Americans, but also Europeans and elsewhere, stuck at home, the service industry took a big hit. People didn't go out to dinner. They didn't go to the movies. They didn't travel. You didn't go to Disneyland. You didn't spend your money there. Where did you spend your money? You spent it on goods for your home because you didn't know how long it was going to last. Am I going to be stuck at home for 6 months or 2 years? I better buy some good cookware, a new sofa, a new widescreen TV, a Peloton bike. I got to get toys for my dog. Basically, the money shifted from buying goods and services to primarily just buying goods, and services took a big hit. What happened was that was an unexpected surge in demand for goods. Even in the best cases, the factories in China could not have kept up with that demand surge. But it was not the best of cases. You had COVID also hitting China, perhaps at a later stage because of extreme measures. You can argue were right or wrong, but it caused a lot of factories to shut down or to curtail production, cut back on tight quarters within the workspace. So suddenly you had a lack of supply with a huge amount of demand. As I mentioned earlier, that causes inflation. On top of that, you had these container ships with limited number of containers, empty containers, limited number of space on the ships. Same is true for trucks, same true with the rail. So the infrastructure getting product from point A in China to point B in the United States was dramatically curtailed. There wasn't enough space to keep up with the demand. Fifth point I wanted to make is about what I mentioned earlier with labor-intensive manufacturing. It was already shifting prior to Donald Trump being president with his anti-China rhetoric and the punitive duty damages up to 25% in some cases, on top of the existing US import duties. In my particular industry, it's an 8.4% import duty under normal circumstances, initially added another 15 on top of that, later cut back to 7.5 additional punitive damage. And essentially what that did, it was basically a kick in the booty out the door of low-cost manufacturing in China in my industry. We were already exiting China because it was no longer cost-friendly. It was cost-prohibitive to manufacture there for the US market. But the punitive duty damage just expedited our flight out of China for production for the US market, at least. The sixth point I wanted to make is, again, that magic buzzword of inflation. Who pays the price when there's inflation? It's typically the poorest of the poor. Those individuals in our economy, let's say it's 30% of Americans who are at or below poverty level, who do rely on going to a low-cost store, a Walmart, a Costco, a Target for their goods, from food to toys and household goods. As inflation kicks in with their limited amount of disposable income, they're the ones that pay the price. And that's actually what happened in our case. The last four points I'll make quickly is that a lot of the production in China, historically, as well as till today, has served the US best interest. A lot of large US multinationals invested billions of dollars in China manufacturing. And they were, and they still are, quite profitable. What's interesting about the China manufacturing setup is that it's a manufacturer to the world, not just for the US market. And that's true for US companies who are invested in China manufacturing. Why did they go to China in the first place 15, 20 years ago? Taking advantage of the low-cost labor. Why are they still there? Why have they continued to reinvest? Because the China market has moved up the economic scale and it's become very attractive. It's also because of economies of scale. It's cheaper per unit to make 1 million widgets than 10,000 widgets. China became the low-cost leader of large quantity manufacturing. And it has the world-class, first-class, much better than the US infrastructure in terms of highways, in terms of rail, cargo rail, in terms of port infrastructure. So essentially what China has done is it's built itself up to be the most efficient way to produce product to sell to the world. And again, the US manufacturers with investment in China have gained on that, because now American companies are making in China to service Japan, to service Korea, to service Europe, Africa, Latin America, and importantly, China itself. The last 2 points I want to make is back to the investment in infrastructure. Another point of my chapter is part of the problems we had during COVID with lack of supply. And I don't want to talk about American-made toilet paper, but let's talk about Chinese products, which Americans wanted to buy, is the US infrastructure to this day remains inadequate. It's 40, 50-year-old infrastructure at our ports, having railheads into the ports to move container traffic inbound. We had bottlenecks every part along the way to get it from the US port onto a rail, onto a truck, to get it to a depot, to get it discharged, to get into a warehouse. There has to be a massive amount of investment, which does create jobs in the United States if we ever want to catch up with what China has created in terms of infrastructure. And the last point is similar to what I made earlier, is politics on both sides, both the US side and the China side, hinder supply chain efficiencies. So the overriding theme of my chapter is I'm a big fan of laissez-faire. Government should stay out unless you're really talking about military, dual-use items, IP infraction, fraud, strategic resources, which I get it. But if you can't pull one of those excuses out, government should stay the heck out and let supply chain and realities and value propositions rule supply chain.
Oh, that's terrific, Dan. Thank you very much. Let me ask, U.S. Imports from China as a percentage of our total imports have dropped from about 21% in 2021 to 13.5% in the first quarter of 2023. So there's been a huge shifting of supply, that is imports, away from China to other markets. Now, your own experience seems to have validated that, that you moved some production out of China to other markets. So I wonder, could you give us some color on those numbers? Where are the shifts in supply chain coming from? And where are companies going?
Sure. The first comment I'll make is about those numbers, because particularly if you would have mentioned third or fourth quarter 2022, I'd have a different answer. But because you brought up quarter one of this year, I think you need to look first and foremost at the state of U.S. warehouses presently. And it's true for the last 6 months. Every warehouse in the United States is chock-block full of merchandise. Because what happened? It's the classic supply chain bullwhip effect, that you react too late to a market change and you overbuild, you overproduce to a demand which is actually on its way down. So as the COVID pandemic in the United States seemed to be going away, people started shifting their funds towards service industry again, travel, restaurants, going to the movies, etc. And they couldn't buy any more Pelotons or sofas or TVs for their house. So with all this pent-up supply manufacturing catching up, larger vessels coming into play, scaled up production in China and elsewhere, the goods started flowing again. And Pete Buttigieg and the Biden administration did a fantastic job of moving product, improving some of our infrastructure bottlenecks, especially on the US West Coast, allowing goods to move again. What happened was the merchandise got in here, warehouses are chock-block full, demand has gone down. So that's one of the reasons you've seen a drop in overall US imports of quarter one versus the year prior. Now, with respect to supply chain shift and manufacturing, the winners, if you will, as China has reduced its exports to the US, number one, first and foremost, has to be Mexico. With the new NAFTA agreement, that the amount of automobiles, white goods, appliances, if you will, larger, bulkier items, which are more efficient to move over the road or via short waterway, is more efficient than moving it from Asia. It's quicker, it's more dependable, less risky. So Mexico certainly has been a big winner. South Asia and Southeast Asia, likewise, have both done very well. In Southeast Asia, all the ASEAN countries, I'd point out probably Vietnam as the biggest winner in Southeast Asia. The amount of mobile phones, footwear, solar panels, a lot of that has shifted out of China. And Thailand as well, with both automobile parts and solar panels, has done well. In South Asia, both India and Bangladesh have done very well. Bangladesh with apparel, India with a variety of products, including agriculture, mobile phones. The amount of shift of production for Apple and Samsung with Foxconn into India right now is booming. It's impacting my industry with some of my sewing workers being stolen away to go make phones. But there is a huge supply of labor that can fulfill that. So India's done very well. And then if you look outside the US market, you look at the European market, Poland has done very well with China manufacturing shifting to Poland. What's interesting is, how does it shift? Is it simply a buyer like myself who looks for sources in another country and just says, okay, I'm going to not place my orders in China, I'm going to place it in India? Or is it the China manufacturer who realizes the amount of hurdles it has to jump through to sell to the US and Western European market, and it's on its own deciding to move some of its production to Northern Vietnam, move some of its production to other ASEAN countries with some great success, even to Mexico? There's a great deal of Chinese investment, FDI, in these new industrial parks in the Maquiladora borderland areas, doing very, very well right now. What you're not seeing is a lot of Chinese investment with a great deal of success in India. What's interesting is China's exporting a lot of its machinery to manufacture goods, used and new both, from China to India. That's a huge market, and it's been booming for the last 2 years, and it still is booming. What's not happening is these industrial parks being set up in India by Chinese companies. There's not a love match going on between China and India for many reasons. Part of it is political, part of it is nationalistic, part of it is rivalry. And historically, they've not always played well together. So it's interesting shifts going on. And it's just one more point I want to get back to is the amount of manufacturing in China coming to the US market might be way down, but doesn't necessarily mean the amount of manufacturing in China is down. It's just shifted to other markets. The Belt and Road Initiative out of China, the BRI, or the One Belt, One Road Initiative, has some great success in exporting products from China to other parts of the world it didn't traditionally sell to. And again, China's own market is absolutely growing. So those manufacturers, whether they're American owned or Chinese owned, who are focused on the China domestic market, are doing very well right now.
You know, you mentioned the historic trends, which we saw in the 50s, manufacturing moving out of Japan and then to Korea and Taiwan, and then moving out of Korea and Taiwan into China, and then out of China. Now, you note that it's Chinese manufacturers, right, are investing in Southeast Asia, but not in India or not in the United States, I don't think very much, but also in Mexico. To what degree are these supply chains dependent on original equipment or supplies or critical parts still coming from China, as companies, particularly say a retailer, wishes to de-risk purchasing their product from Vietnam? Have they de-risked or no? I'm grateful for your thoughts.
I would say it's industry specific, and depending on how complex the product is. I know in my industry, for example, there's certain types of BOPP lamination. I don't want to get too technical on you, but it's a type of imprint that goes on bags where it's a capital intensive investment that remains in China till to this day primarily. And then what they do is they'll ship those printed reams to a Vietnam to have it imprinted onto the product or laminated onto the product. Eventually, will that as well shift to a place like a Vietnam? Absolutely, with time and with scale. But China still has its fingers in the primary parts that need to be assembled elsewhere. And that's still true. And there are still US manufacturers who are shipping some critical parts for an iPhone, if you will, from probably 8 different countries, including Japan, Taiwan, Korea, and United States, to be assembled in China. And the same situation is going to happen in India. Some of those critical parts, especially with the R&D, is still originating in the United States. So it's not just China playing a key role in manufacturing in other countries. United States and Japan, Korea, Taiwan still play that critical role as well.
Let me bring Don and Kerr back in here, if I may, in terms of your perceptions of supply chain movements and de-risking. Particularly from Silicon Valley. Kerr, you have many years of experience in the Valley with lots of tech companies. Does that comport with what you're seeing today?
Oh, it very much does. And I would very much echo what Don was saying, yeah, about the disappointment. You know, I've spent a lot of time in Silicon Valley, and I'm finding that both American tech entrepreneurs and the Chinese tech entrepreneurs are just kind of going around just shaking their heads. You know, they're just really disappointed and frustrated with the current environment. They're feeling opportunities being left on the table. That's the general sentiment that I feel in Silicon Valley for sure. Here, I haven't been down to Hangzhou on this trip. I'm sitting in Beijing right now. Normally I spend more time in Shanghai, but I think I am going to plan a trip down to Hangzhou while I'm here, and probably Shenzhen, and get a sense for what the Chinese entrepreneurs are feeling in those places. But my guess is they feel the same, you know, lost opportunities.
Don, you're in the de-risking business. What are the trends that you're seeing on in the tech sector in terms of supply chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think well, just to echo what Kerr said about disappointment, that is certainly something that I see in my tech clients in China, my tech clients in the U.S. Chinese companies are looking for alternatives for tech sourcing technologies, but they're not really finding it, and there's a lot of disappointment. And similarly, for the U.S. tech industry, there's no real replacement for China. I mean, I think you saw the various CEOs have come out, including the NVIDIA CEO came out and said as much the other day. So that's certainly an issue. I think de-risking is something that U.S. companies are working on. I think they're trying to sort of cordon off the China market as best they can. I'm not sure how successful they're ultimately going to be.
So the book is Selling to China, Stories of Success, Failure, and Constant Change. And the theme here is constant change. We have been through many hurdles, many challenges over the last 40 years. American companies active in China have overcome difficulty after difficulty. At every period, wise people have said it's impossible. This cannot continue. And yet it does continue. And I think that the book, the chapters that you've written, along with your other authors, provides perhaps not a straight and narrow path that one can just walk down, but signposts and indicators and advice and updates on the key issues in U.S.-China relations today. And I'm so grateful that you have written this book. I highly recommend it to anyone doing business in China, really in any industry. I hope that it is widely read. I hope that it is translated into Chinese and made available on the mainland. I hope that students within the university system will take advantage of the wisdom encapsulated here to train the next generation of American companies doing business in China. Our two great countries, our two great business sectors are not going to divorce. We are inextricably intertwined, and we shall remain so for the rest of our lifetimes. The question is, how do we overcome the challenges? How do we avoid a conflict of laws? How do we maximize benefits for the people of both countries? Let us hope that our two governments provide us with a environment, a framework that is stable and predictable for the future, so that the people of both countries can continue to benefit. U.S.-China trade has produced a cornucopia of good for the last 250, 260 years. And I suspect that that'll be true for the next 260 years. So Kerr Gibbs, our editor, Dan Krastenstein, Don Williams, thank you very much for your program today. I wish you the best of luck with this book, and hope that we are able to continue the conversation in the near term. To all of our participants today, thank you very much. And we look forward to seeing you during our next book review. So thank you and have a good evening. Kerr, Don, Dan, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.